Welcome back to Top 5. The spark. Rising tensions lead to a global flashpoint. The world doesn't plunge into chaos overnight. Economic instability, resource shortages, and political rivalries push countries to the brink. Regional conflicts begin to merge. Border disputes between nations escalate, and alliances fall apart as old enemies resurface. An incident at a disputed territory, whether it be a clash over resources, an assassination, or a cyber attack, ignites the fuse. Once the first missile is launched, there's no turning back. Nations scramble to defend their borders, and within hours, every major country declares war. At this point, global alliances like NATO, the EU, and ASEAN collapse as countries focus on their individual survival. Worldwide, military mobilization is swift, with airstrikes and bombings targeting enemy strongholds. 9. Air supremacy and cyber warfare begin. The war is initially fought in the skies and the digital space. As military planes take off from every corner of the globe, the fight for air dominance becomes crucial. Countries with advanced air forces like the United States, Russia, and China initially gain the upper hand. Meanwhile, cyber attacks are launched by tech-savvy nations, disabling power grids, financial systems, and military communication networks. The world is plunged into digital darkness as governments struggle to maintain control. Infrastructure collapses in major cities as power outages spread. Financial markets are devastated, and within days, the global economy grinds to a halt. The civilian population begins to panic as food, water, and essential services become scarce. 8. Naval battles and the struggle for control of the seas. With the skies contested, attention turns to the oceans. The world's largest navies, those of the US, China, and Russia, begin fierce battles over control of strategic waterways. Choke points like the Strait of Hormuz and the South China Sea become battlegrounds, with submarines, aircraft carriers, and battleships exchanging fire. Smaller naval powers also scramble to defend their coastlines and shipping routes, but they are quickly overwhelmed by the larger fleets. Global shipping is disrupted, cutting off vital supply lines for fuel, food, and raw materials. Countries that rely on imports to survive, like Japan and the United Kingdom, begin to feel the strain as their economies collapse. Piracy increases in regions like the Gulf of Aden as lawlessness spreads. 7. Nuclear deterrence breaks down. As the war escalates, nuclear-armed nations face a terrifying dilemma. Initially, nuclear powers, particularly the US, Russia, China, India, and Pakistan, try to avoid deploying their arsenals, knowing that mutually assured destruction looms. However, smaller tactical nuclear weapons are soon used in desperate bids to turn the tide of battles. Once the nuclear genie is out of the bottle, full-scale retaliation becomes inevitable. Massive strikes are launched, devastating entire cities in minutes. Major cities like New York, Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi are reduced to radioactive wastelands. Hundreds of millions die in the initial strikes, and radiation clouds spread across borders, contaminating neighboring regions. The global population begins to experience mass casualties as nuclear winter sets in. 6. Ground invasions and guerrilla warfare. In the aftermath of the nuclear strikes, countries that haven't been completely destroyed deploy their ground forces. With global infrastructure in ruins and supply chains decimated, armies engage in brutal ground invasions to capture territory and secure remaining resources. In regions like the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia, guerrilla warfare becomes the norm, with local militias and resistance groups rising up against occupying forces. Urban centers become battlegrounds, with civilian casualties skyrocketing. Ethnic and religious conflicts intensify, particularly in regions already plagued by sectarian violence. The death toll continues to climb, and millions of refugees are displaced, fleeing across borders in search of safety. 5. Economic collapse. Global trade ends. The global economy, already devastated by cyber attacks and naval blockades, completely collapses. With trade networks destroyed and major financial centers wiped out, paper currency becomes worthless. Bartering emerges as the primary means of survival. Countries that relied on exporting goods and importing essential resources now face total isolation. Without oil, transportation grinds to a halt. Factories shut down, and technological production ceases. Famine spreads across the world as food shortages become widespread. Major agricultural producers like the US, Brazil, and India are unable to distribute food globally. Starvation becomes a reality for billions, particularly in densely populated nations like China, Nigeria, and Bangladesh. 4. Resource wars and the collapse of governments. With no functional global economy, wars over the remaining natural resources, water, fuel, arable land, become the new priority. Oil-rich regions in the Middle East and Africa face waves of invasions from neighboring countries desperate to secure energy supplies. Meanwhile, access to fresh water becomes a key flashpoint in arid regions like North Africa, the American Southwest, and Central Asia. Governments start to crumble under the pressure. Countries like Venezuela, Syria, and Yemen, already weakened by internal conflicts, fall into complete anarchy. Military juntas and warlords rise to power, ruling by force in regions like South America and Sub-Saharan Africa. International organizations like the United Nations cease to function. 3. Bioweapons and chemical warfare. With nuclear arsenals mostly depleted or ineffective due to radiation fallout, countries turn to biological and chemical weapons as a last resort. Labs around the world, from Russia to North Korea, release deadly pathogens, unleashing pandemics that sweep across continents. Chemical weapons are used on battlefields and civilian populations alike, causing mass casualties and creating no-go zones filled with toxic air and poisoned water. Entire regions become uninhabitable as disease and poison spread. Military forces are decimated by new strains of deadly viruses, and the civilian death toll from biological warfare begins to rival that of the nuclear strikes. Quarantines are impossible to enforce, and global pandemics ravage humanity. 2. The breakdown of society, global anarchy. With governments collapsed, infrastructures destroyed, and populations decimated by war, society begins to break down. Lawlessness spreads as people turn to looting, violence, and survival by any means necessary. Cities become ghost towns, with the remaining survivors forming small, heavily armed communities for protection. What's left of the military focuses on protecting leadership and hoarding resources, abandoning the general population. Civilization as we know it falls apart. Advanced technology becomes a thing of the past as power grids remain offline and factories lie in ruins. The global population is reduced by more than half, with survivors scattered across what's left of the world. Tribalism re-emerges, with local leaders and warlords controlling small territories. 1. The aftermath, a new dark age. In the end, the world is left in ruins. What began as a global war between nations has ended in the total collapse of civilization. The survivors, those fortunate enough to avoid the bombings, the bioweapons, and the chemical attacks, live in a new dark age. Cities are abandoned, agriculture reverts to small, localized farming, and advanced technology is a distant memory. The population is small, isolated, and focused entirely on survival. Without communication between regions, humanity is splintered, with no knowledge of what exists beyond their immediate surroundings. The world is a shadow of its former self. Humanity has regressed, and what remains are small, fragmented communities, cut off from one another by the scars of war. The once globalized world is now a patchwork of isolated territories, each ruled by the strongest survivor. The lessons of the past are lost, and civilization must start over, facing a long and uncertain future.